これから午後のセッションを行います。皆さん、核兵器をなくすラン
We
チタイ
would
ムはい
like
かがだった
to
でしょう
now
か
begin the afternoon session. We hope you all had a good lunchtime for those of you here in venue.
核保有国
We will be having another
同盟国に
session
広げる
now
かです。
looking at how to engage
核兵
nuclear
器を
armed
全面
and
的に禁
allied
止し、
states.
その
The
廃絶を定め
TPNW
ている核兵器禁止条約
comprehensively outlaws nuclear
そ
weapons
の大きな
and
課題
calls
は
for their
日
also
本を含めた
abolition.
核兵
However, a
器に
major
安全保障
challenge
を依
now
存する
is to
国
look at
々
how
を
to expand
どう
and
ぞご協力的にお願い
universalize
し
the
ます。
treaty to countries that depend
こ
on
の
nuclear
問題に
weapons
取
for
り
their
組む
national
第一人者たち
security,
を登壇者
which
として迎
includes,
え、
of course,
核
Japan.
兵器禁止
We
条
have
約の
many
普遍化
experts who
と
are leading
今後
these
の展望を
efforts,
議
so we
論し
will
ます。
have time in this discussion
登壇
to
者は
look at the
オ
efforts
ーストリ
towards
ア外務省軍縮
universalization.
軍備
We are
会議
glad to have
日本
Alexander
局
Kment
長
here from the
アレクサ
Austrian
ンダー・クメントさん、
Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much, Alexander Kment. He is the director of the Disarmament, Arms Control, and
核
Non-Proliferation
兵器廃絶
Department.
国際キャンペーン
And from ICAN, the
副事務局
international
長ダニエル・
campaign
ホグスタさん、
to abolish nuclear weapons, we have Daniel HÖGSTA here. Thank you so much, Daniel.
長崎大学核兵器廃
And
絶研
from
究センター
RECNA at Nagasaki
副センター
University, the
長教
Research
授
Center for
河合
Nuclear
公明
Weapons
さん、
Abolition, we have KAWAI Kimiaki. Welcome.
一般社団法人傍ら
From
代
the
表理事
association
高橋裕太さんです。
Katawara, we have Takahashi Yuta.
よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you so much to all of our panelists.
はい、皆さんこんにちは。
So thank you so much, everybody.
今日ご参加いただきまして誠
And
に
I'm so
ありが
glad to
とう
see
ござ
so
いま
many
す。
people here
この
joining
セッシ
this
ョンのモデレー
session.
ターを務め
I
ま
will
す
be the
一般社団
moderator
法
for
人
this
傍ら
session.
で
As
代表理事をし
introduced,
てお
my
りま
name
す
is Takashi
高橋裕太
Yuta,
と申します。今日
and
はよろし
I
くお願いい
am
たしま
leading
す。
the association called Katawara.
はい、このセッ
So
ション
in
はで
this
すね、
session,
核兵器をなくす
we
日
will
本キャンペーン
be
浅野秀夫さんと
looking,
一緒に
and
企
actually
画
I've
をしてき
planned
た
this
もので
together with
す。
Asano
キャンペ
Hideo
ーン
of the
並びにで
Japan
すね、
campaign to
す
abolish
べての
nuclear
関係者の
weapons.
皆さん
So
に感
together
謝を
we've
申し上
also
げたいと
discussed
思います。
with many different campaign
さ
members,
て、
and I'd like
現
to
在
thank all of them
94
first of all
の
on this
国が、
occasion.
核兵器
There
禁
are
止条
now
約に署名を
94
してお
different
りまし
countries which
て、
have
70
signed
カ
the
国以上が批准
TPNW
をしているとい
and
う状
more
態
than
です。
70 have
一方
ratified the
で、
treaty.
今スライド出て
However,
おりま
at
す
the
通り、
same time,
核
as we
兵
can
器
see on the
保
slide
有
for those
国や
Japanese
日本を
speakers, we
含
do not
む
have any nuclear
同
weapon
盟国
states
は
or other
条約
allied
には
countries
参
such as
加して
Japan
おり
which
ません。
have joined
た
the
だ、
treaty at
核
this
兵器禁止
stage.
条約の
However,
第12
as
条
is
に
laid
は、
out in
こう
Article
した
12
国
of
々を
the
念頭
treaty,
に
there
条
are
約の
different
普遍
elements
化
looking
に
at
つ
the
いて定められて
universalization
いま
of
す。
this
で、こ
treaty,
の普
particularly
遍
with
化
these
を進
kinds
め
of
ること
countries
が
in
国際
mind.
社会
And
の
looking at
大き
how
な課
we
題なん
can
ですね。
make progress
で、
in
具
this
体的にですね、
universalization is an
普遍
important
化の努
challenge
力
now
は
for the
何を指すの
international
かということで
community.
すけれど
So
も、
what do we actually mean when we talk
2022
about
年
the
の第1回
universalization?
目の締約国
I would
会議
like
で
to bring
採
your
択をされ
attention to
た
the
行
action
動計
plan, which was
画に
adopted
は
after
次
the
の
first
2 点
meeting
が
of
挙げられてい
states
ます。
parties, which had
1
two
つ目
particular
は
points
諸
which
盟
were
国と
mentioned.
批准国
The
の数を
first
増や
is
すこ
looking
と。
at
で、
increasing
2
the
点目
number
は
of countries
条
which have
約の
signed or
規
ratified
範、
the
価
treaty.
値、
And
基
the
本
second
的
is
な主
also
張の
looking
促
at
進に積
how
極
we
的に関
can
与するこ
have
と
proactive
です。
engagement
で、
with
特
the
に2
norms,
の部分
values,
は、
and
これは条
fundamental
約の価値を
principles
広
of
め
the
るってい
treaty
う
as
意味で
well.
すから、
So
そ
this
ういう
is
意味で
looking
は、
at, of course, how
私
we
た
can
ち市
even
民社会
expand
の取り
further
組
the
みもです
value
ね、
of
こ
the
の普遍
treaty.
化の
And
一
this is
環だと
where
捉えられる
civil
んではないでしょうか。
society
で、ちょっと次のスライ
activities
ド行って
are
い
all
ただき
part
ま
of
し
these
て、
efforts
で、
towards
セッションに入る
universalization,
前
we
に、ここ
believe.
で簡単にですね、
Before
各
we
国の反
join
応を確認
the
してお
full
きたいと思います。
panel
で、
discussion
ま
itself,
ず、
there are a few
核
different
保
points
有
I'd like to
国
share
から
from
は、
responses
この
from
核
different
兵器禁
countries in
止条
regards
約
to
は
this
既存の
criticisms which are
NPT
coming from the
体制
nuclear weapon
を
states,
損
for
なわせるもので、
example,
そし
say
て
that it can
国家間の
undermine the
さらな
existing
る分断を
NPT
招くとの
regime
批判
or
が上がっ
also
ています。
create more divisions
ある
within
いは、核
countries.
兵器禁止
There
条
is
約は
also a
安全保
position
障
which
上の課
says,
題に
for
十分答えていな
example,
いという批
that the
判もあります。
TPNW does not
ま
sufficiently
た、
respond
日本
to
政
current
府は次のよ
security
うに説明をし
challenges.
ています。
The Japanese
核兵器
government
禁止
says
条
that the
約は核兵器のない世
TPNW
界への
can be
出
seen as a
口
treaty
とも
which
言
can
え
be
る
an
重要な条約
important
であるが、
exit
核
towards the
兵器国
world
を
without
まだ
nuclear
1カ
weapons. However, the fact that there is no nuclear weapon states which have yet joined the treaty, Japan does not see it as something realistic in the first time, and rather sees its focus on engaging the nuclear weapon states. At the same time, however, since the first MSP, there have been various countries which are allies with the US or other nuclear weapon states which have joined, such as Australia, or from NATO, Germany, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands have also joined. And at the time, well, it was still just in the process of application for NATO, but Sweden and Finland have also both joined as observers. So in regards to their statements praising the significance of the value of the TPNW at the meetings of states parties, there have been, for example, comments saying about the importance of engaging the nuclear weapon states or needing to do more of this. A comment from Australia after the second MSP in 2023 actually had a declaration which had two different points. First of all, saying that while Australia is not a party to the treaty, it will continue to constructively engage with the treaty in order to seek a realistic path for nuclear disarmament. Or also, Australia's participation in the TPNW is to look at, for example, verification and implementation, also the relationship with the NPT, support for universal points, and so on. So these are different things which have come out from Australia's press releases around the MSP. So based on these kind of things in the background, in this session, we will be particularly looking at, for those countries which do have nuclear weapons or their allied countries such as Japan, how we can expand the treaty in these kind of places, how we can expand that engagement. And also, what is it that citizens can do to contribute to making a change here as well? So before this, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have wonderful people who are here to contribute to this discussion. First of all is, of course, Ambassador Alexander KMENTT, Director of the Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department at the Austrian Ministry. And he has been a very central person in the development and the creation of the TPNW itself. Also, he has been the Deputy Permanent Representative of Australia to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. He's worked on many humanitarian disarmament issues and so on. We're very glad to welcome here today. The second speaker next to them is Kimiaki KAWAI from RECNA at Nagasaki University. Dr. KAWAI, or Professor KAWAI, is particularly looking at civil society and international law and how this is related to the TPNW. He has also, as a member of civil society, participated very actively in the MSP and other related conferences, and he is also part of the Secretariat for the Japan campaign to abolish nuclear weapons as well. So we'll be hearing from him from the international humanitarian law perspective. Next, we have a research assistant from the Arms Control Association. She is based in the US at this think tank. Hopefully, she had planned to be here in person, but her plane was unfortunately delayed. So we have a video message from Shizuka instead. And she is particularly looking at the US perspective in regards to engaging the nuclear weapon states. And the fourth speaker will be Daniel HÖGSTA on behalf of ICAN. So Daniel is someone who has been leading the Cities Appeal or the Parliamentarians Pledge and so on within ICAN, and working very closely with all of ICAN's partner organizations in campaigns and political engagements around the world as well. After the treaty came into effect, he has been particularly looking at engagement with partner countries in the nuclear umbrella states as well, and looking at how we can expand the support for the TPNW within this as well. So he will be speaking a little bit from the perspective of civil society today. So I'm very glad, first of all, to pass over to Ambassador KMENTT for the keynote.
Konnichiwa. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here in Tokyo and to be able to speak to you and participate in this civil society forum. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and that I have the chance to speak about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And of course, I want to use this opportunity to congratulate Nihon Hidankyo very much for having been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year. It was a very timely, well-deserved and thoughtful decision by the Nobel Committee. And I'm sure that this prize is a very significant contribution to raise awareness and understanding about nuclear weapons and the unspeakable humanitarian consequences that are the result of nuclear explosions. The message from Nihon Hidankyo could not be more important than at this moment, when geopolitical tensions are on the rise. The so-called nuclear taboo against the use of nuclear weapons looks increasingly fragile, and we see several geopolitical hotspots that have the potential of escalating to a nuclear conflict with devastating global consequences. Some states, such as Russia and the DPRK, have made overt nuclear threats. Almost all developments in the nuclear field today seem to point in the wrong direction, towards new and multiple nuclear arms races and more reliance on nuclear weapons. In today's dangerous situation, the TPNW is the one international framework that seriously and credibly argues and works for a paradigm shift away from nuclear weapons and away from the permanent threat of global mass destruction. The conviction that such a paradigm shift is urgent is also the reason why my own country, Austria, is such a strong supporter of the TPNW. I was asked to speak specifically about efforts to universalize the TPNW to nuclear-armed states and nuclear allies, states such as Japan, that are under so-called extended nuclear deterrence. TPNW states parties understand universalization efforts as two things. First, to bring more states to formally join the TPNW, which is of course what we want. But secondly, it also means to promote better understanding and raising awareness about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons. This is the rationale on which the treaty is based. And it's also the most important set of arguments to create momentum for change on nuclear weapons, irrespective whether or not a state joins the treaty. The TPNW is steadily gaining strength. We just heard it stands at 94 states that have signed the treaty and over 70 have ratified it. And most recently, Indonesia, the fourth most populous country globally, has joined. And this is remarkable, given the fact that some nuclear-armed states are actively applying pressure on states not to ratify. In addition, we've made significant strides in the past 15 years in raising awareness about the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons, even though much more needs to be done. And to date, only non-nuclear states have joined the TPNW, and all nuclear-armed states are opposed to the TPNW, as are US nuclear allies. So what can be done to change this? Obviously through engagement with these states and their societies. TPNW supporters, of course, know that we cannot simply prohibit these weapons and then they will disappear. Change needs to come through a much more broader and global discourse about both the legitimate and profound arguments on which the TPNW is based, and by engaging with the arguments that are made against the TPNW and for the perceived security need of nuclear weapons. The two main arguments that we hear against the TPNW is that it does not take the international security situation into account and focuses only on the humanitarian dimension. And secondly, we hear that the TPNW is not compatible with the concept of nuclear deterrence, which is seen by nuclear-armed states as an essential security guarantee. And these are legitimate views. Nuclear-armed states and their allies are rightly concerned about international security, as are we all. And they believe strongly that nuclear weapons are essential to address these concerns. So we therefore need engagement specifically on these two arguments. Are nuclear weapons and the policy of nuclear deterrence a guarantee for security by preventing conflicts, especially nuclear war? Or is the theory of nuclear deterrence too fragile, too uncertain, too risky in light of the global consequences if something goes wrong? Are nuclear weapons therefore a threat to all humanity and not a sustainable and responsible security policy? And these are very difficult questions because we are not dealing with certainties. We cannot prove that nuclear deterrence works, nor can we prove that it doesn't work. Even if we can point to a clear success of nuclear deterrence, we cannot be certain that in the next different circumstance it will work again. Nuclear deterrence is a theory. It's not a precise science. It's also not a thing. It's a psychological construct that projects behavior. It works until it doesn't. It is said that the purpose of nuclear deterrence is to deter aggression and to prevent nuclear war. However, nuclear deterrence depends on the credibility of actual use of these weapons. Every day, nuclear-armed states, and in some cases their allies, exercise and plan the actual use of these weapons. They are planning global mass destruction with the belief that credibly threatening this will prevent it from happening. However, the belief that nuclear deterrence will always hold and that nothing ever goes wrong is highly risky. It is a bet. It's not a certainty. And these risks, of course, are carried not only by states that have these weapons or that rely on these weapons, they are carried by all humanity, which of course creates very profound and very legitimate security concerns for all other states. So while there is a lot of uncertainty about if and how nuclear deterrence works, it is undisputed that it could fail and that there could be accidents, miscalculations, or inadvertent use of nuclear weapons. And we have compelling evidence and scientific knowledge of what happens then. A growing body of scientific evidence and research demonstrates that the humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear explosions, let alone a nuclear conflict, would be far graver, more complex, cascading, transboundary, and potentially global than previously assumed. We have to look beyond the immediate horrific impact of a nuclear explosion and look at the global, short, mid, and long-term and systemic consequences on health, on food security, the economy, supply chains, social and societal impacts, mass migration, and so on. And all states would be impacted. Nuclear risks are also more complex and graver than previously known. New and disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence and cyber vulnerabilities are adding further layers of nuclear risks. Also, we know that in the past we have been very close to nuclear catastrophe on several occasions, where luck rather than procedures saved us. So from the TPNW perspective, the fragility and uncertainties of nuclear deterrence, the risks and consequences if it fails, and the worsening geopolitical situation make a paradigm shift away from nuclear deterrence all the more urgent. More reliance on nuclear weapons is not an investment into more security, but only exacerbates the global existential threat. So to come back to the question of what needs to be done for the universalization of the TPNW, we need to have a much more honest conversation nationally and internationally about security and nuclear weapons, about weighing the alleged security benefits of nuclear weapons against the uncertainties that are inbuilt into nuclear deterrence, and the known consequences if something goes wrong, and the risks that something goes wrong with this theory. Foremost of all, this conversation should be raised to a much higher level of political attention. As long as nuclear weapons are viewed as essential by states that have them, they will of course not take credible steps towards nuclear disarmament. That the change of paradigm is essential for the future of humanity, rather than continuing to have nuclear weapons, is therefore the key point of universalization efforts. However, the TPNW is based on scientific research and very legitimate security concerns of all states, those that do not have or do not rely on nuclear weapons, but are also exposed to their existential threat. And thus far, we've seen very little readiness by nuclear armed states and their allies to engage with these arguments and these legitimate security concerns. So a good place to start this conversation would be to acknowledge that we do not know if nuclear deterrence works or doesn't work, but we know that it can fail. And what prudential conclusions should be drawn from this lack of certainty? Moreover, this conversation should not be had only with security policy experts, but should involve other experts and stakeholders, people who understand the breadth of consequences and risks. We also need more scientific research on the consequences and risks. Much has been done in the past years and decades, but much more needs to be done to understand what nuclear conflict would really mean globally and systemically in our societies. We should bring the discussion about nuclear weapons to other international institutions, organizations that deal with health, humanitarian emergency assistance, with the environment, with economic aspects, and many more. Much more information, granular, detailed information should be requested from governments that practice nuclear deterrence. How do they think nuclear weapons could be used in accordance with international law? What are the concrete plans to deal with the effects of nuclear explosions in their own countries? How are the consequences on other states considered in nuclear planning? And many more such questions, because we're dealing with existential threats to all humanity. So the conversation needs to shift from assuming that nuclear deterrence will hold forever and nuclear weapons will not be used to a much more detailed discussion about what happens if they are used and if nuclear deterrence fails. The TPNW is not an antagonistic treaty. It is based on very profound and legitimate arguments and ultimately shared security concerns. It is therefore an urgent invitation to a conversation about an existential threat for all humanity. TPNW states parties have invested into having such a conversation through an intensive consultative process over the past year. Austria, which was mandated to coordinate this process, will present a comprehensive report to the meeting of states parties next month, which will hopefully open the door for a much more meaningful and constructive engagement with and by nuclear armed states and their allies. This is also pertinent for the discussion in Japan, where I understand the question of participation as observer at the TPNW meeting of states parties is discussed very intensely. And of course, participation in international conferences is a sovereign decision of states. I would just say that in my view, all states that share the goal of a world without nuclear weapons should be part of this important conversation. This is particularly the case given Japan's unique experience with the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and especially since we are commemorating 80 years of the destructions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I close with that this global conversation is urgently needed. And even if states don't yet want to join the TPNW, civil society in all states should demand that this conversation is had with urgency. Thank you very much for your attention. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you so much, Ambassador KMENTT. These were some really important points for us to begin our conversation in this session. So thank you once again. So thank you, Ambassador KMENTT. Following these remarks, we will have some comments and questions from Professor KAWAI, and then we'll come back to Alexander KMENTT after that for his response. to the points raised by
ありがとうございます。
Kimiaki.
ご紹介をい
Thank
ただき
you
ました。
very much. As
長崎大
introduced,
学
I am
核兵器
from
判決研
RECNA
究
at
センター
Nagasaki
から参りました河合
University,
と申し
the
ます。
Research Center
どうか
for
よろ
Nuclear
しくお
Weapons
願いいたし
Abolition.
ます。
Thank you so
今
much for
コ
this
メント大使の方
opportunity.
から
As
非常
Ambassador
に
KMENTT
包括
has
的
shared
で
today,
本
we've had
質
a very
的な
comprehensive and really
プレゼンテーショ
fundamental
ンがありましたので、その
presentation
こと
on
を
the
前
current
提にしてです
situation.
ね、
And so keeping this
私の
in
方か
mind,
ら3
I'd
つ
like
質
to
問
share
を
three
準備して
particular
ますね。ちょっ
questions
とス
or
ライド
things
次
that
の
I'd
スライド
like
にし
for
ていただ
us
けま
to
すか。
explore together. We'll
次の
have
ス
them
ライ
on
ド
the
ですね。
slides. Apologies that it's only
はい。
in Japanese.
大きくこの
But the
3つ
first,
の
so
テ
there's
ーマに
three
即し
different
てです
themes
ね、
or points that I would like to
質
raise
問をしな
in
が
the
ら、
conversation that will continue from now.
そのなぜ
And I
そういう
look
質問が
forward
必要なのかと
to
いうことについて
hearing
説明しなが
responses
ら
on
私
these, but I'd
のコ
also
メントを
like
す
to
ると、こ
explain
ん
a
な
little
感じに
bit
したいと思いま
about
すね。
why I think
で
these
は次
questions
の
are
スライ
important.
ドお願いします。
So the first
じゃあ
one
質問
is
の1番目
looking
なんですけ
at
れども、
how we
核
can
依
have
存国に対する
constructive
建設的な関与
engagement
の方法、
with the
関与しな
nuclear
ければいけないという
dependent
コメント大使か
states.
らござい
As
ましたです
Ambassador
けれど
KMENTT has
も、
really outlaid the
そこ
need
に
for
対
this
する
kind of
質問としてで
engagement.
すね、
So my question in regards to
TPNW
this
の普遍化を
is
進める
within
上
the
で、
process of the
核抑止に
universalization
依
of the
存する国々、核依
TPNW,
存国
how should the
の
national
国家
security
安
needs
全保
of
障
countries
上の
that
ニ
are
ーズにどう
dependent
対
on
応するべきでし
nuclear
ょうか
deterrence
という
in
質
their
問を
current
考
national
えました。
security policy?
なぜこのような質問を
And
考
the
えた
reason that I
か、
wanted to
それは
consider
です
this
ね、
kind of question
TPNW の
is to
理念を
look
広める
at,
こ
of
広め
course,
ること
it
は
is
大
very
変重要な
important
ん
to
ですけれ
promote
ど
the
も、
ideals of the
核依存国はです
TPNW,
ね、
but at the same, nuclear
TPNW
dependent
が
states
安全保
argue
障上
that
の
the
課題
treaty
に
does
十
not
分に
adequately
応え
meet
てい
their
ないというふう
current
に主張している
security
からなんです。
challenges. This is the statement that they
で、
are continuously
核依存
making.
国に対し
So what
て、
kind of
核
effective
兵器の廃絶が
approach
より良い安全保障
is
の
there
選択肢で
to
あるというふうに
persuade
説得す
such
るためには、
states that
説得しな
abolition
けれ
of
ばいけ
nuclear
ないん
weapons
です
is
から、
actually a better
どのよう
security
なアプローチ
option?
が考えられる
What
のか、
kind of
ア
approach
プロ
is
ーチ、
needed
ま
for
た議論
that?
の仕方が
What
考え
kind
ら
of
れるのか、
way should we have
こ
this
ういう
kind of
背景があり
discussion
ま
or
す。
debate?
じ
That's
ゃあ
in
具体
the
的に
background of
どん
why I
な
wanted
論
to
点
raise
が
this
考えられる
question.
かなん
And
です
some
け
of
れ
the
ども、
different specific arguments that could be
例えば
considered
ですね、
within this are,
安
for
全保障と
example,
軍縮の
in
循環
order
論
to
法を打
break
破す
this
るため
kind
に
of
どのような議論
circular
が進むべき
logic
か。
of
これどういうこ
security
とか
and
と言いますと、
disarmament, what should we do to break
安
through
全保
this? So,
障
for
をする
example, this is looking
軍
at
縮
those
をする
people
ため
or
には
those
安
states
全保
that
障
say,
の環境が整
in
ってなけれ
order
ばいけない。
to
こういう議論
pursue
がですね。
disarmament, we
だ
need to
けれ
have
ど
the
も、
security
軍
things
縮をしな
lined
けれ
up in
ば
place
安全保障
already.
が
But then also,
守ら
without
れないという議論が
achieving
ある。で、こ
disarmament,
の
there is
議論
also
って
the
いうのはです
argument
ね、
that it's not
軍縮を
possible to
求める側
ensure or
と
to
安全保
achieve
障を
security.
強調
So
する
this
側
kind
で
of
ですね、
goes
いつも
around
繰り
in
返し言いたく
circles
てで
in
す
a
ね、
way, and this
軍
is
縮
something
の
which
た
is
めには
often
安全保障が必要
repeated
だ。
in this
安全保障の
circular
ためには軍
logic,
縮が必要だと。
saying
これがず
disarmament
ーっ
is
と繰
needed
り
for
返されてる、
security,
こ
but
ういうの
security
循
is
環
needed
論
first
法
for
というんですけ
disarmament.
ど、
And
そう
this
いう構
kind
造に
of
あるので、ま
circular
ず
logic
議論
goes
がそういう
round
構
and
造にあ
round
ること
sometimes in
を
a way.
しっ
So
かり
first of
認
all,
識して、
recognizing
それを
the
さら
structure that
に、
is behind this debate
今
or
はまあ
this
打ち破る議論っていうの
logic
がある
and
の
looking
か
at
って
how
いうよう
we
なことを
can
ちょっと考え
then
なきゃいけない。
break through
これが
this.
一つ
This
目
is
と、
something that
あともう
we
一つは
need
で
to
す
think
ね、
about. And the
代
other
替
point
的
is
な安
also,
全保障の
well,
仕
what
組み
kind
と
of
して、
alternative
地域的
security
な非核
mechanisms
地
can
帯
be
の
effective?
提案
And
という
what
のは
is the
有効
role
なの
of,
か。
for
これどういうこと
example,
かっていうと、
regional
安全
nuclear
保障の
weapon
具
free
体的な
zones
代
for
替
that
案があり
purpose?
ますかっていう議論が大概
So,
な
of
されるん
course,
ですね。
when we speak
そういう
about
こ
the
とを念頭にす
TPNW
る
or
と、
these
い
things,
や、こうい
people
うプラン
say,
があり
well,
ま
what
す
kind
よ
of
というふう
alternative do
に
you have in place
提
to
案する
provide
ことというの
security?
は、
And so
カウン
ensuring
ターア
that
ーギ
we
ュメント
do
とし
have
て有効
responses
では
and
ないか、こ
counter
れを考え
arguments
た
for that.
ということです。
There is the
で、
concept of
二
nuclear
つ目で
weapon
す
free
ね、
zones as
核兵
one
器の使用
potential.
と威嚇に関す
The
る法
second
的
point
評
is
価の活
looking
用
at a legal
ということなん
assessment
です
of
けれ
the
ども、
use or
これは
threat
先ほ
of
ど、ク
nuclear
メント
weapons and
大使
how
がで
that
す
could be
ね、
used to
核兵
universalization of the TPNW. Ambassador KMENTT spoke about, of course, the question of whether it is possible to have any use of nuclear weapons that would actually be legal under international law. This is my particular field of research, and so this is a very important point. We can look at, for example, the 1996 International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion, which found that the use or threat of nuclear weapons is generally illegal. This is, of course, an advisory opinion, which is very well known to many people. But how can we use this advisory opinion in a practical way? Next year is actually going to be the 30th anniversary of the ICJ's advisory opinion. So this is a good time maybe to revisit this, to look at its meaning, and particularly if we look at it from questioning the legality of nuclear deterrence policy, looking, for example, of course, the UN Charter speaks about the use of force and the threat of use of force as both things which are prohibited. And sorry, this is within the TPNW as well. So how should we be looking at the legality of nuclear deterrence policies within nuclear dependent states? This is something that we could look at even within their different domestic legal issues, or what kind of presentations, what kind of discussions, what kind of debates could be had on legal issues regarding deterrence in each country. I have a lot of ideas on this, but in regards to this kind of question, how we can ensure that this can be done in the most concrete and tangible way, for example, with the states parties or within different discussion that Ambassador KMENTT has been presenting, what kind of things should be considered within these kind of platforms for discussion as well? And also, how should we then look at how to incorporate these kinds of legal assessments into a strategy for universalization as well? And the third point is looking at how to use or leverage the relationship with the TPNW and the NPT to facilitate the involvement of nuclear dependent states in the TPNW process. This is something that I believe that we should also be consider. And is there a way that we could actually leverage this to make it easier to facilitate their participation? The reason I am asking this is, of course, the NPT is held as the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And within the Japanese policy, of course, they always come first with the statement that the NPT is of vital importance. You know, the NPT is such an important treaty. However, the credibility of the NPT has been shaken when we see the ongoing nuclear arms race in the world. Also, issues such as nuclear sharing or the AUKUS situation, the agreement, for example, looking at the different questions that this is posing to the NPT regime is also something which is a common point of discussion or concern for all of the countries, including nuclear dependent states as well. And so if we're looking also, well, the TPNW claims that it embodies the NPT's nuclear disarmament obligations. At the same time, the nuclear dependent states argue that it undermines the NPT, which is the complete opposite. So what kind of arguments and strategies do we need to bridge this divide, which is existing within the discourse? And so concrete or specific arguments to look at within this is, for example, when we see that the credibility of the NPT is now rather shaken, how can the TPNW actually help to strengthen and reinforce the NPT? Of course, you know, governments like Japan always say that the TPNW is undermining the NPT, but it's actually, how can we persuade that it is indeed the opposite, that the TPNW as a counter-argument contributes to strengthening and reinforcing the NPT? And also, would cooperation by nuclear-dependent states with TPNW objectives be effective in actually strengthening the NPT? This is also some questions that we can pose to the nuclear states and their allies. This is something that could be done, for example, after participating as an observer. This could be questions that could be raised even without actually joining the TPNW. Through cooperation in this regard, this would actually contribute not only to the TPNW, but also into reinforcement or strengthening of the APT, particularly when we see the shaken position or the lack of credibility in regards to the NPT. How we can actually use this for the positive could be something very effective as well. So I will end my questions there. Thank you very much. So we'd like to ask Ambassador KMENTT. They're very deep questions, but if you could ask your response.
Thank you very much. Indeed, excellent points. And how much time do I have? Okay. Yeah, very, very, very deep and difficult questions and important questions. The first one was how to address the security concerns of states that say that they need these weapons. The first thing I would say, what about the security concerns of the rest of the world? Yeah, we have about 40 countries that have nuclear weapons or rely on nuclear weapons, and they create obviously existential threats to everybody else. And states that do not have these weapons haven't given their consent. They have no way of influencing this, and they don't even really know the details about the threat because, of course, all of this is national security. So that there is obviously a problem in a sort of discriminatory approach to security. I think that would be the first point. The second point, I think, is obviously if nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence works, it is a contribution to security. But the problem is we don't know for sure. And given that the consequences are so incredibly severe and the risks are so incredibly high, we need to balance this issue. I try to say that we do not know for sure. I cannot disprove nuclear deterrence. But people who have nuclear weapons can also not prove nuclear deterrence. And the prudential principles, if you don't know, is it meaningful, is it responsible to continue with an assumption of security behind which is an existential threat that could extinguish all life on this planet? So is it up to TPNW states parties to come up with a different security paradigm? I think it's up to the states that have these weapons to reconsider very seriously if their security belief in nuclear weapons is sustainable and responsible vis-a-vis the whole rest of the world. And that's a difficult conversation because a lot of it is not a hard science. A lot of it is very much very deep entrenched beliefs. But as I tried to say in my statement, is that I think we have to start by acknowledging that there is no absolute certainty. Nuclear deterrence is not a guarantee. It's an expectation of a guarantee. It's a hope of a guarantee. And given what's behind this, the potential threat to end life on this planet, we have to be very, very careful. And of course, the discussion about this cannot be states that have these weapons looking at it from a national security perspective only. It is an existential global issue. So it needs to be dealt in that way. Very good point about the circular logic, the circular discussion, disarmament versus deterrence, and so on. We often hear the argument that nuclear disarmament is a very good objective, but the security environment doesn't allow it. And of course, to wait for an ideal security environment as a precondition to be able to make progress on nuclear disarmament is completely disingenuous, because such an ideal security environment will never exist. We cannot wait till milk and honey flows and everybody gets on well with each other. Given the existential threat of nuclear weapons, we have to make progress on nuclear disarmament in a world where there will be competitive security challenges. So nuclear disarmament has to take place in this world and not wait for a distant future. That is in German, you would say, throwing sand in somebody's eyes. Yeah, this is disingenuous. Yeah? The challenge is, and the responsibility is, to make progress in this security environment, given the existential threat. Yeah, you made very good point on the legal dimension. I think there is a lot that needs to be done. Yeah, because some nuclear weapon states do not want to talk at all about how international humanitarian law would be respected. One nuclear weapon state, the US, has said that they would use nuclear weapons only in accordance with international humanitarian law. But what does this mean in concrete terms? What are the procedures and the principles to ensure that the principle of proportionality is observed? How can you observe the principle of proportionality with a 5-megaton nuclear weapon? It's almost inconceivable. How can you distinguish between civilians and combatants, which of course is foundational for international humanitarian law? The weapons themselves, the way they function, are incompatible with international humanitarian law. This is why the International Committee of the Red Cross has said it is very hard to envisage that they could ever be used in accordance with international law. The scenarios where it may be possible is the use against nuclear weapons against an isolated aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean or in a Gobi Desert. But these scenarios are, of course, not the reasons given for the justification for nuclear weapons. So if you have a real discussion about compliance with international humanitarian law, the case where nuclear weapons theoretically could be used lawfully completely undermines the justification for having nuclear weapons as deterrents. And the third point, very important, relationship between the NPT and the TPNW. The assertion by skeptics of the TPNW that there is anything in the TPNW that undermines the NPT is a complete smokescreen argument. TPNW states parties are all states parties of the NPT. They are all in good standing of the NPT. They are all deeply concerned about the fragility and the loss of credibility of the NPT, which is why they went for the TPNW in order to support the NPT, in order to restore credibility to the NPT. So obviously, a prohibition of nuclear weapons for those states who become party to that is a contribution to Article 6 of the NPT nuclear disarmament. This is an obligation on all NPT states. Obviously, the disarming can only be done by states that have these weapons, but the prohibition of nuclear weapons can be done by every NPT state. So how can a prohibition of nuclear weapons be anything but supportive of the NPT, its obligation on nuclear disarmament? Moreover, it's called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the TPNW is based on the argument, as I explained, the consequences are too severe, the risks are too severe. No responsible country should have these weapons. What is this other than raising the bar against the proliferation of nuclear weapons? So obviously the TPNW supports nuclear disarmament and supports non-proliferation. So other than saying that the TPNW, that there is a problem with the NPT, we've actually never heard any meaningful argument to back this up. So I think it is a step that states that are concerned about the state of the NPT and about the state of the global nuclear regime, if they want to take today a step that supports this regime, that invests into this regime, they should support the TPNW. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございます。続いて、倉光さんからビデオでメッセージが寄せられていると思うんですが、それを再生していただくことできますか？
So next we have a video message.
No sound.
音が出ますか？
Please wait a moment when we bring the
Very much,
video
Ambassador
sound
Comment,
on.
for the keynote, and thank you very much to the International Civil Society Forum to Abolish Nuclear Weapons for having me today on a panel with such a terrific, experienced speakers. I am very honored, and also I regret I cannot join online, so just like the panelists will not be able to make it in the forum in person or for today's session due to my flight connection issues. The ambassador already might have touched upon these issues that I will address, and if this is the case, please disregard my points. I have 2 points I would like to make regarding the universalization of the TPNW. First, with the recent return of the US President Trump in power, it reminded me me of his first term and also of his political appointee, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who led the U.S. and U.S. allies' strong boycott of the TPNW negotiations back in 2017. And the situation is a little bit different now that the treaty is enforced. However, with reflecting the new U.S. presidency and also unpredictability as well as uncertainty, inviting U.S. nuclear umbrella states to observe the TPNW meeting of state parties seems becoming more and more challenging. So my question is, at least how could TPNW states parties or perhaps civil society how could they minimize such criticism against the treaty from nuclear weapon states or maybe umbrella states? As a person who is now based in Washington, D.C., I feel the urgency to lobby nuclear weapon states, at least not to discourage third parties to consider the participation or the support for the treaty. As France and UK may continue pressuring and the US may likely become more vocal about actively discouraging additional states from signing or ratifying the TPNW, how could we at least minimize such discouragement and pressures from nuclear weapon states that are considering the support for the TPNW? And in addition, in particular, with the recent U.S. context, as President Trump has decided to take quite severe measures against Colombia, and such snapping and coercive actions involving deportations, tariffs, and sanctions could happen as a result of the support for the TPNW directed to these countries that are trying to support the TPNW, but not yet the parties to the TPNW. If the new president would like to actively block universalization efforts. So to summarize my first question, is there any TPNW states parties' efforts to relatively tone down nuclear weapon states' opposition, at least not to vocally criticize the treaty? And following that, what kind of diplomatic approaches are already in place, especially with this new presidency? So this is my first point. And my second question is, I think it would be very similar to Dr. Kawai's point. How do you perceive the universalization on the value of the TPNW? So it is not only about the number of the member states or signatories. Could there be some connections to this universalizing the treaty itself, such as numbers, and also preserving the norm that the TPNW has established? What I mean by the value of the TPNW is that the strong international norm against use, nuclear threat, and also nuclear testing, so which that is something that TPNW helped enforce, this norm. So, however, these norms are now at very fine lines, and I am keen on hearing your views on if this defending and upholding the value of the TPNW would be relevant or somehow useful to this treaty universalization conversation. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
はい、ありがとうご
Thank
ざいま
you
す。
very much for those questions
過去
online
冬国アメリ
from
カの中からちょっ
Shizuka.
と厳しい
So we've had these questions from the
コメントいただ
perspective
い
of
たと思
someone
いま
in
すが、
DC looking at
ちょっ
the
と時間が押してお
challenges
り
in
ま
the
し
US
て、
at the moment.
ICAN
We
の
are running a little bit
ダ
on
ニエル
time, so we're
さ
going
ん
to
の
go
方か
straight into
らコメン
Daniel's
トをいただい
remarks
て、ダニエ
next.
ル
We'll hear
と
from Daniel
静香さん
from
と合わせて
ICAN,
黒田大使にコメン
and
トいただ
then
きたいと
after
思い
hearing
ます。
from Daniel, we'll come back to Ambassador
ダニエ
KMENTT.
ルさんお願いします。
Thank you very much. It's an honor to speak now and after such esteemed and high quality presentations as well. I just want to thank you first of all to the organizers, to the Japan campaign, and everyone that's been involved in organizing this. It's been incredibly inspirational to see how it's all come together and the effort that's going into it. And it certainly gives us in ICAN a big boost to take some of the ideas that we've learned here back to other countries where we work as well. So thank you so much. So as Yuta mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to speak a little bit more from an activist or campaigner perspective. And I think the first thing that I'd start with is to acknowledge that we cannot sit back, and perhaps this is obvious, right? We cannot sit back and wait for the nuclear armed states and their allies to do the right thing. History shows us that the perpetrators of an injustice will never fix it on their own, out of the goodness of their heart. They have to be pushed to change. We also cannot accept the argument that nuclear disarmament can only be achieved through a slow, gradual, step-by-step process, which could take generations. This is not an issue that we can afford to delay. Nuclear weapons are an urgent and an existential threat. We also need to make the case that, the framing of this session shows us, is that it's not just the nuclear armed states that are the problem. Their allies play a crucial role in legitimizing these weapons, shielding them from scrutiny and accountability. Without these allies, there would be far greater pressure for disarmament on the nuclear weapon states themselves. I'd like to talk a little bit about changing the narrative, changing the way that we talk about nuclear weapons. And Miho set this up very well in the session this morning on stigmatization. We need to challenge the way that nuclear weapons are talked about. Of course, it starts with focusing on the humanitarian consequences, but it's also about rhetoric. I'd like to quote from Nihon Hidankyo's Nobel Peace Prize lecture, in which Tanaka-san said, quote, "I hope the belief that nuclear weapons cannot and must not coexist with humanity will take firm hold among citizens of nuclear weapon states and their allies, and that this will become a force for change in the nuclear policies of their governments." That is so important. Spreading the belief itself will become a force for change. This is not a passive thing, it's an active effort. We often hear from the nuclear armed states and their allies, as Ambassador KMENTT mentioned, that the world is not ready for nuclear disarmament or the security conditions are not right. But as Ambassador KMENTT rightly said, these claims are not based on any kind of evidence. The reality is probably that there can never be peace while nuclear weapons exist. History teaches us that the greatest strides in disarmament have been made during moments of high tension, moments like we're in right now. And for other inhumane weapons, landmines, cluster bombs, chemical and biological weapons, the prohibition came first, followed by the process of elimination. That's why the TPNW is so important. But we have to be mindful about how we talk about nuclear deterrence. It is a theory, it's not a proven science. It might even be abstract modern art because the arguments are contradictory and don't seem to lead anywhere. No shade on anyone who is into modern art, I should say. We see how nuclear armed states and their allies constantly reinforce this idea about nuclear deterrence. In the UK, for example, almost every mention of the country's nuclear program refers to it as their nuclear deterrent, subtly suggesting that these weapons are defensive and necessary. And this is language that comes from the government and is repeated in the media. They've been very effective in shaping media. This framing itself makes it harder to challenge the legitimacy of nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the companies profiting from nuclear weapons invest heavily in marketing that focuses on this term as well, nuclear deterrence. It avoids the reality of their impact. These companies, when they do their marketing, and they spend lots of money to do that, they do not want the public to focus on what these weapons actually do to people, to cities, to the planet, because they know how unpopular that truth would be. So we have to do everything we can to change the language ourselves. Nuclear weapons should always be referred to as weapons of mass annihilation or weapons that cause unacceptable humanitarian consequences. Instead of talking about nuclear deterrence, we in civil society should describe it as what it really is: threats to cause mass destruction, threats to inflict a humanitarian catastrophe. And while it's important to have the right arguments and tackle the arguments, we in civil society, we need to recognize that nuclear armed governments and their allies are not truly interested in a debate. They will not be convinced in direct dialogue or debate. Their actions indicate they are planning to maintain nuclear weapons indefinitely, even when they talk about a world without nuclear weapons. And they come up with a string of reasons for why they cannot act now. So what we have to do is we have to delegitimize nuclear weapons. We have to make it harder for them to keep nuclear weapons than it is to rid themselves of them. Even nuclear armed states care about legitimacy. Even these states that are supposedly the most powerful states in the world. Losing it can mean political isolation, economic consequences, and weakened international influence. And that's why, as Ambassador KMENTT noted as well, we need to broaden the conversation. Nuclear weapons threaten progress on every other major global issue: climate change, public health, poverty reduction, biodiversity, any of the issues, the pressing issues that we're facing right now. Any gains in those areas could be erased in an instant by the use of nuclear weapons. This means that the experts from these fields should be involved in the fight for disarmament. Their voices, their perspectives, and their influence can help shift the debate. And the good news is that there is a new UNGA mandated study to look at the global impacts of nuclear war, first in several decades. And this will do just that. It will bring new voices into the nuclear disarmament debate. Nuclear weapons must also become a bigger political issue. And that's why ICAN focuses so much on getting support from parliamentarians and to make the topic of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons an issue in as many parliaments of nuclear weapon states and nuclear allied states as possible. And we congratulate the work of the activists here in Japan in this. There is growing momentum to engage parliamentarians and a push for Japan to observe the third meeting of states parties. It would be a tragedy if Japan continues to boycott the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Local governments also have a role to play. And maybe I'll talk about this a little bit in my concluding remarks. Local politics can help shape the position of national party politics. And so does the financial sector. In many nuclear armed states, private financial institutions provide the funding that keeps nuclear weapons programs running. Tarek Ralph mentioned it this morning. If banks and pension funds divest, they send a powerful message, not just the arms manufacturers themselves, but to the governments, that nuclear weapons are no longer an acceptable investment. And finally, we must highlight the TPNW is already working. It can never go fast enough given the urgency of the problem, but it is making progress. Already, about half the governments in the world have either joined the treaty or have at least signed it. And we've seen the impact that it has had on the widespread condemnation of the threats to use nuclear weapons in the context of the war in Ukraine. And we see the impact it's having on the financial sector. We have to do everything we can to make sure that it cannot be ignored by the nuclear weapon states and their allies. And of course, the well-deserved and long overdue Nobel Peace Prize to Nihon Hidankyo will give even more of a boost for our shared cause. So, Alex, my question is going to be a bit lighter than the ones that came before. What do you hope will be the main message from the third meeting of states parties in order for what happens in the room there to resonate outside in the world? Thanks.
ありがとうございます。最後のクエスチョンについ
Thank
て
you
どうで
very
しょうか。
much. So, Ambassador KMENTT,
Thank you very
your
much.
comment.
Again, very, very good comments, very good questions. There was a question about the potential positions of the new US administration. And I have to say, I don't want to speculate about that because these policies are in development. So we don't know for sure. I think it's probably fair to say that it will be generally a more skeptical approach towards multilateralism as a whole. At least that's what we've seen in the first administration of President Trump. So it's not just about the TPNW. I think it's more about questions how the US will position itself vis-a-vis the regime as a whole. So the TPNW is an element of that. There was a question whether TPNW states parties should tone down their positions. I have to say the TPNW is not an antagonistic treaty, as I said. I think we have demonstrated very clearly in the first and second meeting of states parties that we talk about the weapon and our concerns about the weapon. We are not aggressive vis-a-vis particular states. We do not mention particular states. It is about the weapons and our concerns vis-a-vis these weapons. So if any government chooses to disagree with that, of course, that's absolutely fine. But to take sort of proactive actions against the strongly held opinion of states that are organized in a treaty, even if other countries are not part of the treaty. So I do not see why states parties of the TPNW should tone down anything, because it's not an antagonistic treaty. Of course, there could also be, multilateralism is challenged as a whole. International law is challenged. So there could be, and I hope for, counter developments. There needs to be a rallying behind multilateralism and behind international law. So maybe that's an answer to the situation that we see. The more multilateralism and international law are under threat, I think the clearer it is how important they are, specifically countries who say that they believe in rules-based international order. So we need to all rally behind this. Yeah, the second question was on the value of the TPNW, irrespective of increasing the numbers. And as I said, universalization means, of course, getting more states to formally join, but it's also about promoting what the treaty stands for. And of course, we want states to join the TPNW, but if the TPNW and the arguments on which it is based creates pressure so that states who don't join take steps towards disarmament, that's also a good thing. So whether or not they join, so of course it's important to promote these arguments. And I'm completely fine with that. If states never join the TPNW, if they take steps towards disarmament, that's perfectly fine. And of course, that's the theory of change of the TPNW. The more states join the treaty, the more these arguments are getting supported and take root in the international discourse, the harder it will become to continue to justify this existential threat on everyone. So essentially, if the international community votes with their feet against nuclear weapons, that may create the political pressure and momentum to see positive change. And then if we see this change, whether or not it's in the TPNW or if it's in implementation of Article 6, it doesn't really matter, I think. And of course, to Daniel's question on the message. I know that the discussion in Japan is very much focused on that Japan takes part as an observer. And I think absolutely, in my view, Japan should be part of this conversation, given its declared position on nuclear disarmament and, of course, its unique history. But the main message of the meeting of states parties should not be who participates as observer or not. The main message is that these are states that are investing into a world without nuclear weapons, that they have built a treaty, they are building a treaty, they are implementing the treaty, they're thinking through what needs to be done, what are the steps that are necessary in terms of victim assistance, in terms of building on the elimination of nuclear weapons in the logic of the TPNW of states having come to the conclusion that nuclear weapons are unacceptable. So this should be the message of investment into common security, into international law. I think that's a strong message, and I think it's an extremely urgent message given what's going on globally. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。最後のコメント大使の発言を引用する形になります
Thank you very
が、
much.
核兵器禁止条約に入るということももちろん
TPNW,
重要ですが、
of course, it is
条約からで
important
きた
to
こと
be
で、
a
その
part
外
of
でですね、核兵
TPNW.
器
But
廃絶ない
because
しは
the
核
treaty
軍
is
縮への動き
there,
が広がっているというような
and
ご発言
we
だっ
are
たかと
actually sort
思い
of
ます。特に
expanding
去
the
年は
significance,
国
the
連総
value of
会やあるいは
TPNW.
未来サ
Last
ミット
year,
の中で
and
国連
future
全体
summit
でで
as
すね、
well as the
核兵器廃
General
絶への合意が
Assembly,
生まれたとい
I
うこと
think there
があり
was
ました。
the
私、その現場にい
agreement
たものですか
on
ら、
the
それ非常に印象的
disarmament
に覚えてい
and
ますけ
the
れども、
abolition of
そういう
nuclear weapons
側
was
面を
talked
捉え
about.
てもですね、
I
核
was
兵器禁
there,
止条約
so
の
I still
意義
remember
が
that
広がってい
very
るというふうに
vividly.
捉えられ
So
るんじゃないでしょうか。
significance of
で、ここまでのと
TPNW,
ころで、
significance of nuclear
核兵
disarmament has
器の議論
been
を深めていくため
going
のいろん
around
な
and
論点が
spreading.
出されてきた
We
と思い
have
ます。こ
been
の議論を深
discussing
めるということ
various
がある意味では、
points
今
of
日のセッションの目
argument,
的だったような感じが
which
するん
is
ですけれど
one
も、
of our
最後に
sort
です
of
ね、
the
皆さんからお
purpose.
一言ずつコメントをいただ
Finally,
きたいんですが、
I'd like to take
今日は
a few
多
words
くの
from
市民の皆
each
さ
one
ん
of
がいら
you.
っしゃっています。
This time
私も
we
含
have
め
a
てです
lot
ね。
of
ですから、
public
市民一人
audience,
一人がです
myself,
ね、
citizens,
この核
and
兵器の
other
議論を深めて
citizens.
いくために、
And in order
ど
to
ういうこと
deepen
がで
this
きるのか、
argument and this
どういうふうに役に立つのかとい
discussion,
うことを
how
踏まえ
can we
て、
citizens
お一人、3
contribute
分ぐらい
to
でコ
this?
メントいた
And
だけれ
probably
ばと
3
思って
minutes
おります。
each of you, the
でまず
panelists.
は、河合さん、お願いします。
So, Professor Kawai,
ありがとうございます。私
Thank
の
you
最
very
後の
much.
スライド出していただいていいですか。
if you can show the last slide of mine.
はい。ありがとうございます。
Yes,
一緒に考えましょうということで、
I said,
今、
let's think
モデレーター
together.
の高橋さんの
As the
方から市民として
moderator,
何ができるかということでですね、
Takahashi-san
私の
said
今日のお話
what
と、それから一緒に
citizens
考えた
can
いことについて
do.
まとめてみました。
So, this
で、
is a
こ
summary of what I
のセッシ
want
ョ
to
ンのテーマ
say.
は核
The
兵器禁
theme
止条
of
約
this
の普遍化と何か、
session
こう
is
い
the
うテーマで、その中で、
universalization of
核依存国、核
TPNW.
兵器依存国に対してどう関与するか
So,
ということがテ
how
ーマで
we
した。
are engaged
で、
with
その
the
時にです
nuclear
ね、まず
dependent
普遍化っていうのは
states as well as the
多様な
nuclear
側面がある
weapon
という
states.
ことなんですね。
And there are
条約の理念
various
を普及することもあれ
aspects
ば、
of the
核依存国へのニーズに
universalization.
対応しなきゃいけな
And
い。
of course,
対応する場合には
we
どういう議
have
論の仕方をす
to
るかということ
meet
も
with the
大事だ。
needs
それから
of the
TPNW そのもの
those
の強化が大事
countries
だ。
and
で
how
ここ
to
ら辺のことはです
enhance the
ね、
new
私の方が、キ
TPNW.
ャンペーンから委託を受けてですね、提言書
So
の
we
ドラフト
received
みたいな
the
ものを書かせていただき
request
ました
for
の
the
で、
campaign.
そのディ
So
スカッ
I
ションが明日ありますので、
actually
もしご関心がある方はそこで
wrote a
議論を
draft.
することができれば
So we are
と
going
思
to
います。
have that
で、
discussion
2つ目、
tomorrow. So if
普
you're
遍化っ
interested,
ていう言
please
葉は
come.
漢字3文字でやや難しい、そういう気もします。
Universalization is
で、
very
実は私、
difficult.
長崎にいま
There
し
are
て、
only three
長崎で
characters
です
in
ね、この問
Japanese,
題に非常に関心を持って
Chinese
いる、 ジ
characters.
ャーナリストの
I'm
方と
in
議論した機会
Nagasaki
があるん
and
で
I
すけれ
had
ども、
some discussion
普
with
遍
the
化って何だ
journalist.
ろうと。
And we
で、
actually sort of
それっ
wondered
て
what
実は条約を育て
universalization
ることじゃ
means.
ないのって
Probably
い
we
う
agreed that
話
we
に、
have to
そのジャー
foster,
ナリストの方と
develop
話し合いながら
the
ですね、
treaty.
ストンと落ちるものがあったんです。そうだ、普遍
And
化っていうと
I
漢字3文字なかなか難しいんですけど、
but the
条約を育てるっていうふ
universalization
うに
is
考えればで
quite
すね、
abstract
い
and
ろいろ
difficult.
な
But
関わ
if
り
we
方が我
think
々にも出てくるんじゃない
we
か。
have various
核
ways
兵
to be
器
engaged
禁止
with
条約をどう
TPNW,
育てるか。
how to
そ
foster
れ
it,
から
how
核兵
to
器禁止
expand
条
it,
約を誰が育てるのか
who
という
is
ことです
going
ね。
to foster
で、
the
そうすると誰
treaty.
がという話になる
When
と、
we talk about
そこ
who,
にじゃあ市民は入りますか、入るんであれば、
citizens
市民
inclusive,
はどんな役
yes.
割がありますか。
And what would
で、じ
be
ゃあそ
the
こで市
role
民の
of
役割について
citizens?
最後一言。
Then we can
これはで
actually
すね、
talk.
良い
Citizens'
問い
role.
を使って 議論を提起することが大事じゃないか。
I think
という
it
こと
is
なんで
very
すね。
important to participate
言
in
葉を使うことは誰
discussion
でもできます。でその
using
中で今日クメント大使やダニエル
the
さん、
very
ク
effective
ラミスさん、私を
wordings.
含めいろんな問題点
All
と
of
か
us
課題を提示しまし
talk
た。
about
それ
the
を使って
various
いただいてです
issues
ね、
and the
問いを作って質問を
so to
政
come up
策立
with the
案者、議
good
員さん、
question
いろんな
and
人
we
に投げ
will
かけてほしいん
give
です。
these
で特に
questions
政策
to
立案者、
policy
政治家の
makers
皆さんは
and the
質問される
politicians.
とですね、お答えするのが
When
お仕
they
事なんですね。
receive
ですからお答え
questions,
していただ
it
ける
is
ように
their
質問を作って
responsibility
お答えする。
to
お答
answer
え
the
をしていた
question.
だかないとお仕事していただい
So
たことにならないので、その意味で
their
質
work
問、良
is
い
to
質問を作
respond
っ
to the
て
question.
どんどん
So
質問
we
する。
will come up
で
with
私
good
は実は大
questions
学で教
and
えてもいる
pose
んでです
that
ね、学生にもよ
to
く言います。
politicians and the policymakers.
理解を深めるため
I'm
には良い
teaching
問
the
いを作ることだ。
students in
問
my
いを使っ良い
university
問いを使っ
in
て議
order
論
to
を深
have
め
the
ます。
good
こんな話を
learning
します。
and
そうい
the
う意味で
good
この問題について
discussion.
もその
We
方
will
法論
come
が
up with
ま
good
あ使えるんじゃないか。こんなふうに
questions.
思いました。
Good
今。
questions will be lead to the good discussion.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you.
ダニエルさんお願いします。
Thank you very much. I'm going to focus the closing remarks, just calling back to a few things that you said in your opening presentation, Yuta. I mean, first of all, it's really important to keep the nuclear armed states and their allies, in particularly first, keep them engaged as much as we can. That's what observing is about. But we also need to take advantage of the opportunities that arise politically. We have two tools of a political nature in ICAN, the Parliamentary Pledge, the ICAN Parliamentary Pledge, and the ICAN Cities Appeal. And I want to, Yuta, you talked in the beginning about the examples of, Germany, Norway, and Australia, and, why they are observers. But I want to talk a little bit about how that happened, because I think it's not just that they decided to observe out of the goodness of their hearts, they had to be forced to be there. And I think that goes back to also remember back to the negotiations where the Netherlands was the only NATO state to participate, and they didn't participate willingly. They were forced to be there because of a parliamentary motion that was initiated by civil society activists and individuals calling their members of parliament to get them to vote in favor of that. And similar thing with the observer status. If we look at Norway, for example, the work to get Norway to observe started many months before. Our partners in Norway targeted the local Labour Party, local governments that were, controlled by the Labour Party, which is a very big party in Norway, but was out of government at that time. And they got them to vote in favor of the cities appeal, and more cities joined the cities appeal. And what that meant was that more and more local Labour politicians became aware of the topic of the TPNW, which they otherwise wouldn't have been. I mean, we're talking big cities, but we're also talking small cities. Then when the Labour Party convention came around, when they were going to decide what is our platform and what is our policy when it comes to nuclear weapons, suddenly we had a majority of voting members within the party who were in favor of the TPNW. There was hard pushback. Many of you might be familiar with the former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who is also from that party. And I can guarantee he pushed back as hard as he could to try to push back against the TPNW reference, but it wasn't enough. We had already done the work in the beginning to make that happen, and I think that's very instructive. And for lack of time, I'm not going to go into the examples in Germany and Australia, but it followed a similar pattern. I'll just end with we don't know when the political circumstances will change to be in our favor. Right now, of course, I think any of us in civil society will look, and especially those of us who work in nuclear weapons complicit states, will look at the situation there seems to be very little room for progress. But we don't know how quickly that progress can change. But what we do know right now is that we have to be prepared for that change to happen. And we have to be prepared to engage. And that means doing the work now, even if it seems like progress is far away. So keep pushing on Japan. I hope to see them at the 3 MSP, but even if they're not there, I know that you'll keep pushing and we'll get there eventually. So thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Daniel, for these words, and particularly you're, of course, a professional in working with parliamentarians, both from the local and national level. So looking at how we can continue this as well is something that I hope many people will hear more from you over the 2 days. So Ambassador KMENTT, some final words from you.
Thank you. Of course, I agree very much with the comments made by the two previous speakers. I think the way the nuclear weapons discussion is constructed, it's very easy for ordinary people to feel overwhelmed. It's a security policy expert discourse. It's full of acronyms, concepts that are very clever, very complicated. So it's easy to feel that I don't understand. I can't do anything about it. So it's really about having agency. So I think it's absolutely not naive to ask for change on nuclear weapons and the existential threat that they pose. And I think specifically in countries that have a public discourse, democracies, it's possible to have agency on this issue. So it's not a God-given thing. It's a political choice. So the justifications of nuclear weapons are, of course, mutually reinforcing among the countries that have them. If you ask China why they have nuclear weapons, they will point to others. If you ask the US, they will point to others. So it's mutually reinforcing. So obviously you have to start somewhere, and I think it's not a bad idea to start this conversation in countries that have democratic systems, because that's actually the strength of democratic systems, to have public discourse on all issues, even if they are contentious. So we also have contentious discussions on climate change and human rights. Why shouldn't we have them on nuclear weapons? So it's about agency, and I think it's really important for ordinary citizens to ask questions, as was said, and to demand answers. These are not God-given concepts. Everything about nuclear weapons are political choices that are contingent and that can be changed. So I agree with all the steps that my colleagues have mentioned, but I think it's this principal point, not be intimidated about engaging into the nuclear weapons discussion, because it's absolutely legitimate to ask pertinent questions, because at the end of the day, every single living being on this planet depends on nothing going wrong with nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, we've gone a little bit over time, but we would like to thank all of our panelists for this session, looking at the situation in relation to the TPNW now, and confirm that we can make a difference as citizens. And the treaty is something that we will all continue to promote and to nurture and develop together. And this will contribute to the universalization of the treaty. I hope that we will continue to look at this together. We will have more opportunities for discussion on this tomorrow in the different workshop and smaller sessions as well, and we look forward to your participation. Thank you once again to all of our presenters from this panel. A large round of applause.